The morning was bright and the streets were filled with the usual buzz of life. Cars honked, people chatted as they walked down the sidewalks, and the faint smell of coffee drifted from the corner cafe. She moved with purpose, her steps steady and calm, a quiet confidence in the way she carried herself. She wasn't in a hurry, but she knew where she was going, and nothing could shake her focus. The city had a rhythm of its own, and she had learned long ago how to move with it without losing her sense of self. She passed by small shops and open-air stalls, where vendors called out to passers-by. A man selling flowers smiled at a customer nearby, handing over a bouquet with care. She caught a glimpse of a young boy playing with a dog at the edge of the sidewalk, his laughter ringing clear in the morning air. It was one of those ordinary mornings that felt peaceful, the kind of day where nothing seemed out of place. Yet in a city like this, peace was often fleeting. As she approached a familiar street corner, the sound of rumbling engines began to grow louder. She didn't pay much attention at first, thinking it was just a group of motorcycles passing by. But as the engines grew louder and closer, she realized it wasn't a casual ride. The sound was deep, loud, almost aggressive, like a warning more than a mere noise. She looked up and saw them, a group of bikers gathered near the street, leaning against their machines, laughing and shouting among themselves. They weren't just riding. They were making a scene, their presence commanding attention as if the street belonged to them for that moment. Her pace didn't falter. She had walked this street many times before, and she knew how to navigate through different crowds without drawing unnecessary attention. But something about this group felt different. They weren't just loud. There was an edge to their energy, a sense of challenge in the way they looked at anyone who crossed their path. She could feel their eyes on her before she even reached them. One of them, tall with a leather jacket covered in patches, stepped slightly forward, smirking. She noticed the subtle smirk, the kind that suggested amusement at someone else's expense, though it was meant to intimidate. As she moved closer, she could hear the words, low at first but gradually getting louder. "Hey, look at her," one of them called out, his voice rough and mocking. "Where do you think you're going all dressed up like that?" Others laughed, a sharp, harsh sound that echoed against the buildings. She felt the weight of their stares but didn't let it break her composure. She kept walking, her steps deliberate, her gaze steady, though her mind was already analyzing the situation. The bikers weren't subtle about their attention. They leaned on their bikes, shifting slightly as if to block her path without actually moving. Their laughter and comments grew bolder, louder, trying to provoke a reaction. "Don't tell me she's walking alone," one shouted, shaking his head in exaggerated disbelief. "What's the matter? Lost your friends?" The others laughed harder, clearly enjoying the show they were trying to create. She felt a flicker of irritation, but she didn't let it show. Years of experience had taught her how to handle situations like this. Most people would either ignore them, rush past, or respond with words that could escalate things. She didn't need to do any of that. There was a different way to handle people who thrived on making others feel small. She kept her movements calm, almost slow, letting them believe they had the upper hand. Some bystanders began to notice. A man waiting at a nearby bus stop shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the scene. A woman walking her dog stopped for a moment, uncertain whether to move closer or turn away. There was a tension in the air, subtle but noticeable, like the quiet before a storm. The bikers, sensing an audience, seemed to grow bolder. One of them stepped closer, the smell of gasoline and leather mixing in the air, his posture challenging. "You sure you're heading the right way, little lady?" he asked, his tone dripping with mockery. His friends laughed behind him, clearly expecting some kind of reaction. She didn't respond immediately. Her mind was moving fast, cataloging every movement, every expression, every possible outcome. There was no need for words yet. Words could escalate. A single wrong move could turn the situation messy. But she didn't intend to give them that satisfaction. Instead, she adjusted her bag slightly on her shoulder. A simple movement, nothing dramatic but precise. It was as if she was drawing a line in the sand without making it obvious. She could feel their confusion, a slight pause in their rhythm, but it lasted only a fraction of a second before they regained their composure. Yet that pause was enough to remind her of something important. Confidence was not loud. It was steady, unshakable. The bikers laughed again, but there was a hint of uncertainty now, as if they were testing her resolve, wondering if she would break. "You just gonna walk past us?" another asked, leaning on his bike. "Ain't scared, are you?" She didn't flinch. Her eyes met his, calm and unbothered, and in that moment, she didn't just walk. She commanded her space. Her calmness was a statement louder than any words could be. A few people on the sidewalk whispered to each other, noticing the tension. Some phones were subtly raised, capturing the moment. In the city, these kinds of confrontations happened, but rarely did someone handle it with the quiet strength she was showing. The bikers were used to reactions, fear, anger, surprise, but not this. Not composed, unshaken confidence. One of the bikers, growing impatient, revved his engine slightly. The sound was sharp, almost aggressive, an attempt to dominate the space and intimidate her further. She paused just for a moment, acknowledging the action without showing any fear. The pause was measured, not hesitant, just deliberate. In that brief silence, everything seemed to hang. The movement of the crowd, the hum of the street, the weight of the biker's attention. Then, as if realizing she wasn't responding the way they expected, one of them muttered under his breath, a mix of frustration and disbelief. "She's not even scared. Not even blinking." It was a small comment, but it spoke volumes. She wasn't just a passerby. She was someone who understood her own strength, who knew how to read people, who didn't need to fight to prove her worth. Her steps continued forward, slow and deliberate. Every footfall was controlled, every glance measured. She moved through the space with ease, not running, not retreating, simply existing in her own rhythm while the bikers tried to impose theirs. Their laughter faltered slightly, unsure how to respond to someone who wasn't reacting the way they had planned. A few people on the street started to look more closely. Sensing that this wasn't going to end like a typical confrontation, the bikers glanced at each other, their confidence wavering just enough to reveal their surprise. She didn't make a single threatening move, didn't raise her voice, didn't let the situation control her. Instead, her calm presence created a contrast so strong it unsettled them. She reached a point where the biker's path could potentially block her. It was subtle, the kind of moment most people wouldn't even notice unless they were paying attention. She didn't hesitate. Her awareness was precise, every detail accounted for. The distance between her and the motorcycles, the angle of their bikes, the reactions of the people around. She was in control, and that control came from patience and observation, not aggression. The group shifted uncomfortably, their laughter now tinged with uncertainty. They weren't used to this. Most people would have either run, argued, or made a scene. She did none of those things. She just kept moving, her eyes forward, her body language strong yet unassuming. It was as if the space around her belonged to her alone, and the bikers were merely intruding. She could feel the energy of the street change slightly, the subtle shift that happens when someone refuses to be intimidated. People started to give her a bit more space, a few nodding slightly in quiet respect. The bikers, on the other hand, exchanged brief, awkward glances. The mockery that had seemed so easy moments before now required effort. Effort that was starting to falter. At that moment, she realized something important. This encounter, while small, was a reflection of life itself. People would try to impose, to intimidate, to mock, to test limits. The question wasn't about winning or losing in a traditional sense. It was about presence, about self-assurance, about knowing your worth even when others tried to diminish it. That thought anchored her, grounding her in a calm strength that the bikers could feel even if they didn't understand it. Her path continued, the engines now fading slightly as she moved past the edge of the street. The tension was still present, but it no longer had the same weight. She had set the tone without saying a word. She had walked through a storm of mockery and intimidation without letting it touch her inner calm. The city continued around her, noisy and bustling, but she moved with a quiet rhythm of her own, a rhythm that could not be shaken by loud voices or empty threats. As she disappeared into the flow of the city, there was a subtle sense of anticipation in the air, not for her reaction, but for what might come next. The bikers, though still loud, were no longer fully in control of the moment, and she, walking with calm confidence, carried with her the knowledge that true strength often speaks in silence, in poise and in presence rather than in volume. That morning, the city witnessed a quiet kind of courage, one that didn't need recognition to exist. And while the encounter was only just beginning to unfold, it was clear that she would handle whatever came next with the same steady strength she had shown from the very start. She was ready for what was coming. And the bikers would soon learn that underestimating someone based on appearances was a mistake that could change the course of an encounter in an instant. The bikers' laughter had settled into a low hum, but the energy in the air was far from normal. They hadn't expected someone to simply walk past them with such calm confidence. Most people would have either reacted with fear, anger, or an attempt to argue back, but she had done none of that. She moved with a quiet strength that seemed to unsettle them without her even speaking. Her presence alone was enough to make them pause and reconsider their usual antics. One of the bikers, taller than the others and wearing a dark leather jacket with a number of patches, narrowed his eyes. He didn't like being ignored. In his world, people were supposed to react to show some sign of weakness or discomfort. That had been the standard, the unspoken rule. But she had broken it. He glanced at his friends, almost asking for confirmation that they were seeing the same thing. "What's with her?" he muttered under his breath, the amusement in his voice mixed with confusion. The group shifted slightly, making subtle adjustments to block her path more clearly. It wasn't a full charge or aggressive move, but it was enough to signal that they were escalating. The street felt tighter now, the engines of their bikes rumbling softly, almost like a background growl. She noticed the subtle changes, the way they moved in unison, trying to assert dominance. But she wasn't intimidated. Her steps slowed just enough to let them feel the space she occupied without giving them an opening to corner her. "Hey," one of them called out, this time louder, with an edge that carried both mockery and challenge. "You think you can just walk past us like that? Ain't scared?" His voice echoed off the nearby buildings. A few pedestrians paused to watch, sensing that something unusual was unfolding. They had seen bikers confront people before, but rarely had they seen anyone stand so composed in the face of such attention. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she glanced briefly at the man who had spoken, her eyes steady and unflinching. In that glance, she communicated more than words ever could. She was aware, she was calm, and she was prepared. She was letting them think they were still in control, while quietly assessing their behavior. Years of experience had taught her to read people, to see beyond the surface of intimidation. These men thrived on making others feel small, and they had assumed she would react like everyone else. But she wasn't just anyone. Another biker revved his engine, a sharp sound that carried a note of impatience. The vibrations rolled along the pavement, demanding attention. He leaned slightly forward, making sure his bike seemed bigger, more threatening. The group laughed, but it was slightly forced this time, a little less sure. They could sense that the dynamic had shifted, though they didn't fully understand why. She continued walking, her pace deliberate. Her bag rested comfortably on her shoulder, and her body language was open yet firm. There was no fear in her movements, no hesitation. She could feel their eyes following her, the weight of their attention, but she remained unshaken. The street seemed to widen in her mind, giving her space while keeping the bikers contained in the energy bubble they had created themselves. "You gonna just keep walking?" one of them shouted now, stepping closer. His friend laughed behind him, and she could hear the slight uncertainty in their tone. They were testing her, trying to provoke a reaction, but she didn't give them one. Instead, she slowed just enough to make eye contact again, calm and steady, like she was aware of their games but refusing to participate. The tension grew. The sound of engines, the laughter, the murmurs of people nearby. It all combined into a low, heavy hum that could have been overwhelming if she hadn't maintained her inner calm. But she had learned how to ground herself in moments like this. Breathing steadily, aware of every movement around her. She was ready to respond if necessary, but only on her terms. One of the bikers moved in slightly more aggressively this time, placing himself directly in her path. He was grinning, clearly expecting her to react with fear or annoyance. "Well," he said, leaning on the bike, "you just gonna stare at me all day?" The others laughed behind him, their voices carrying both amusement and an expectation that she would make a mistake. She didn't respond verbally. Instead, she shifted her stance subtly, a slight adjustment that let her weight settle evenly. It was a small gesture, almost imperceptible, but it sent a signal. She wasn't intimidated, and she was prepared to move in any direction if necessary. She had trained herself to understand that calmness could be stronger than aggression, observation more powerful than rash action. The man blocking her path tilted his head, clearly confused. Most people would have either stepped back, argued, or made some quick move. She did none of that. Her movements were controlled, deliberate, and confident. The subtle difference in approach unnerved him, and for the first time she saw the uncertainty flicker in his eyes. A few bystanders began to watch more closely. A man leaning against a lamppost pulled out his phone, trying not to be obvious as he recorded the encounter. Others slowed down, sensing that something was about to happen. The energy in the street was tense, like the moment just before a decision had to be made. The bikers, though loud, were no longer fully in control of the interaction. One of the bikers tried to regain dominance by stepping even closer, his posture aggressive. "Don't just stare," he barked, his voice rough. "Say something." He expected words, some reaction that would put her in a vulnerable position. But she didn't rise to the bait. She simply moved slightly to the side, shifting her weight with precision, letting him feel that his attempt to corner her was failing. The group's laughter faltered again. They were skilled at reading reactions, but this was unlike anything they had encountered. The calm, measured way she moved, the confidence that didn't waver, it threw them off. One of them glanced at his friend, eyebrows raised, silently asking, "What's going on here?" They had lost the simple control they were used to having over such encounters. A woman walking her dog stopped nearby, holding the leash a little tighter as she watched. A few other pedestrians whispered to each other, unsure whether to intervene or simply watch. The bikers sensed the attention and tried to recover, but the uncertainty had already taken root. She could feel it, subtle but powerful, the shift in energy from confrontation to something undefined. Then, without warning, one of the bikers moved forward, a more direct approach this time. He wanted to see if she would flinch, step back, or react with anger, but she didn't. She planted her feet firmly, ready to respond with precision if needed, but not a moment before it was necessary. Her eyes met his steadily, her calmness amplifying the tension. "Why are you so calm?" he asked, almost muttering to himself. The others chuckled nervously, clearly noticing that their usual tactics weren't working. They were used to people reacting quickly, fear, anger, surprise, but she had none of that. She had control over herself, and that control was far more disarming than any loud voice or aggressive gesture could be. The street seemed to hold its breath. Her slow, deliberate movements, the steady gaze, the lack of verbal response all created an atmosphere that the bikers hadn't planned for. They were skilled at intimidation, but they weren't prepared for someone who didn't play by their rules. And that unspoken awareness made them uneasy. Finally, she took a small step forward, not aggressive, not confrontational, just precise. It was enough to let the bikers know she was aware of their space but wouldn't allow them to dominate her. The subtle movement carried weight, a message that she wasn't scared and wasn't going to be pushed around. The taller biker exhaled sharply, almost involuntarily. He had expected a fight or at least a sharp reaction. Instead, he got calm, measured, unshakable poise. For a brief moment, the street was quiet except for the low hum of engines and the whispers of onlookers. Even the air seemed charged, thick with anticipation and uncertainty. The others tried to regain their confidence, laughing nervously, revving engines lightly, but the dynamic had shifted. The woman walking through the street had changed the rules without even trying. She wasn't loud, she wasn't angry, and she didn't need anyone else to prove her strength. Her presence alone was enough to shift the balance. She continued moving slowly, never hurrying, never retreating, always aware of the space around her. The bikers attempted one last show of bravado, but it felt hollow now. Their laughter was weaker, their movements hesitant. They had assumed control, but she had silently taken it back. The energy in the street was no longer theirs to command. By the time she had passed the edge of their group, there was a subtle change in the air. Bystanders who had been hesitant now looked on with quiet admiration. The bikers were left standing, their confidence shaken, unsure of what had just happened. She didn't stop, didn't gloat, and didn't acknowledge them further. She simply continued, calm and composed, leaving behind an unmistakable impression of strength that didn't require words or confrontation. The tension in the street had reached a point where every movement seemed magnified. The bikers were no longer fully in control, though they tried to appear confident. Their laughter was uneven now, forced, and their casual postures had lost their ease. They had assumed she would react like everyone else, that she would either argue or retreat, but she had done neither. She had walked through their intimidation with calm, steady confidence, and that alone unsettled them more than anything they had thrown at her. But she knew the moment wasn't over yet. Confidence was one thing, but situations like this often required action to fully resolve. She could sense it in the subtle shifts of their bodies, the way they leaned slightly forward, the small flexing of fists, the quiet muttered words to each other. They were testing her limits, trying to provoke a reaction that would confirm their control. She didn't intend to give them that satisfaction. Instead, she prepared herself for what she knew might come next, watching, listening, ready to respond at exactly the right moment. The tallest of the bikers stepped closer again, narrowing his eyes and blocking a wider path. He was clearly the one trying to take the lead, expecting her to flinch or respond aggressively. "Don't just walk past," he said, his tone rough and mocking. "Say something at least." His friends snickered behind him, but the laughter was weaker now, lacking the earlier confidence. They were sensing that their usual tricks weren't going to work. She didn't speak, didn't argue, and didn't even flinch. She simply shifted her weight slightly, her body balanced and prepared, her gaze unwavering. Every step she had taken until now had been about observation and positioning, understanding the people around her and the energy they carried. Now it was time for the next phase. She didn't need to fight with force. She only needed precision and awareness. Suddenly, one of the bikers tried a more direct move. He leaned slightly forward as if to intimidate her physically, testing whether she would step back. A moment of silence fell over the street. Bystanders stopped in their tracks, sensing that something significant was about to happen. The engines of the motorcycles idled in the background, the rumble almost like a low warning. She had trained herself to notice every subtle cue, the tilt of a head, the shift of weight, the unspoken intent in someone's eyes. And she knew this was it. She acted in a single fluid motion. Not reckless, not aggressive, but decisive. Her foot shifted, her stance adjusted, and with one controlled movement she sidestepped just enough to cause the biker's balance to falter. It was a subtle move, nothing dramatic, but perfectly timed. He staggered slightly, his surprise clear, and his friends gasped in shock. The street seemed to hold its breath as the realization hit. She had done something they hadn't expected, something they hadn't anticipated at all. The tall biker blinked, momentarily off guard, and that fraction of a second was enough. She didn't need to strike or shout. Her single, precise action had disrupted the flow of their intimidation. They had assumed control by their sheer presence, by loud words and aggressive posture, but she had taken it back silently, effortlessly. Her calmness had turned into a tangible force, one that they couldn't ignore. Her eyes scanned the group quickly, assessing their reactions. The others were frozen, unsure of what to do. Their usual rhythm, the way they controlled situations, was broken. The laughter and snickering had died down almost completely. Some were glancing at each other, their expressions betraying confusion, frustration, and a hint of fear. They had never met someone who could read them so easily, anticipate their moves, and neutralize their intimidation without ever raising a hand. For the first time, she allowed herself a small, subtle step forward, still calm, still deliberate. Her movement wasn't threatening, but it carried authority. The taller biker took a step back instinctively, surprised by her poise. She didn't push. She didn't need to. Her confidence and precision had already done the work. Every eye on the street, from bystanders to the bikers themselves, was focused on her. The people around her began to react. A woman walking past paused, her eyes widening slightly. A man leaning on a fence muttered under his breath, impressed despite the quiet nature of the confrontation. Phones appeared, cameras subtly raised by those who wanted to capture the moment. Even the smaller details, the whisper of the wind, the faint hum of engines, the way the sunlight glinted off the motorcycles felt part of the scene, as if the city itself had taken notice of her presence and the way she handled the situation. One of the bikers, still trying to save face, stepped forward again. "You think you're tough?" he barked, his voice slightly shaky now. His friends hesitated behind him, unsure whether to continue the act or retreat. He expected a reaction from her, a retort, a flinch, anything that would put her into the usual roles of fear or anger. But she remained calm, her expression neutral, her stance grounded. She let her body language speak for her. Standing tall, shoulders relaxed but firm, her gaze steady, she conveyed a sense of control far more powerful than any words or gestures could. Her presence alone unsettled the bikers further. The street seemed quieter now, as though even the city itself had paused to watch. The group's energy, once dominant and aggressive, had lost its cohesion. They were no longer in command of the moment. She was. Then she acted again, still subtle but decisive. A shift of weight here, a slight adjustment of stance there, a movement that seemed small to an untrained eye but was enough to unbalance the bikers' expectations. One of them stumbled slightly as he tried to mimic the aggression they were used to wielding. It wasn't a fight. It wasn't violence. It was precision and awareness, the kind that comes from knowing exactly how to handle a tense situation. The other bikers glanced at each other, confusion and disbelief etched on their faces. Their usual confidence, built on loud words, intimidation, and posturing, was unraveling in real time. The quiet power of her actions was impossible to ignore. She didn't need to shout, to throw a punch, or even to confront them verbally. Every calculated movement, every measured step, spoke louder than anything else in that moment. Her calmness created space for others to recognize her strength. Bystanders, who had been cautious at first, now watched openly, some with admiration, others with awe. The woman with the dog whispered to herself, eyes fixed on the scene, while a man leaning on a lamppost muttered softly, impressed despite himself. The dynamic of the street had changed completely. The bikers were no longer the center of power. She was. The taller biker, realizing he had underestimated her, attempted to regain control. He revved his engine again, trying to intimidate, trying to force her into the expected reaction. But she didn't flinch. She simply observed, ready, poised, aware of every subtle cue from him and the others. She had learned that control wasn't about reacting to aggression. It was about managing one's own presence while guiding the outcome silently. Her next move was fluid, natural, almost effortless. She adjusted her position slightly, making a subtle movement that caused the tallest biker to lose his balance completely for a brief moment. He staggered back, his friends gasping in disbelief. The crowd reacted almost instinctively, murmuring in surprise, some raising their phones to capture the moment. The balance of power had shifted irreversibly. At that point, she could sense the final flicker of their bravado fading. They had no plan for dealing with someone who could anticipate and neutralize their intimidation without a single act of aggression. Their confidence had crumbled, leaving only awkward postures, uncertain glances, and forced laughter. She stood firm, calm, and collected. A quiet authority that demanded recognition without needing to assert dominance verbally. A few bystanders took cautious steps forward, some whispering to each other, clearly impressed by the way she handled the situation. Even the biker's own friends seemed uncertain, as if questioning whether they should continue or retreat. The taller biker tried one more subtle move, but it lacked conviction, lacking the power of intent. She had already claimed the moment, and there was nothing left for him to assert. Finally, she allowed herself to take a slightly larger step forward, still measured, still composed. Her body language radiated confidence, calmness, and readiness. It was enough to make the remaining bikers step back instinctively, as if understanding that further attempts would only deepen their embarrassment. She didn't need to shout or threaten. The simple act of standing firm and moving with intent had done everything necessary. The street slowly began to breathe again. The engines idled in the background, quieter now, almost hesitant. Bystanders exchanged glances, some nodding slightly in admiration, others whispering in surprise at what they had just witnessed. The energy of the bikers had shifted completely. They were no longer dominant, no longer intimidating. She had turned the situation around with a calm, controlled approach, proving that strength often comes in silence, precision, and awareness rather than loud words or brute force. As she moved past the edge of the group, the realization of what had happened settled in. The bikers were left standing, stunned, their confidence shaken, their usual rhythm disrupted. She didn't look back, didn't gloat, didn't even acknowledge them further. She simply continued, her steps steady, her gaze forward, carrying herself with the quiet strength that had allowed her to navigate the entire confrontation successfully. That day, the street had witnessed more than just a moment of tension. It had witnessed a quiet demonstration of power, awareness, and confidence. And as she disappeared into the flow of the city, the bikers and the onlookers alike would remember the unexpected turn, the moment when calmness and precision won over intimidation and aggression. The street seemed to exhale as the tension finally began to ease. The bikers, once loud, confident, and aggressive, now stood frozen, their faces a mixture of disbelief, embarrassment, and quiet frustration. The calm, controlled woman had shifted the entire balance without raising her voice, without threatening anyone. The bystanders, who had been holding their breath just moments ago, now whispered among themselves, some nodding with quiet admiration. The shift in energy was tangible, and it seemed to ripple through the street as if the city itself recognized what had just happened. The tallest biker, the one who had tried to dominate the interaction from the start, ran a hand through his hair, a nervous gesture that betrayed the strength of her presence. He exchanged glances with his friends, trying to gauge what had just happened, how someone so calm could diffuse a situation that they had assumed they controlled completely. His smirk was gone, replaced by a puzzled expression. They had underestimated her, and now the embarrassment was hard to mask. She continued to walk at a steady pace, her steps measured and deliberate. There was no need to hurry, no need to show that she was in a rush. She moved with the certainty of someone who knew they had faced a challenge and emerged unshaken. Her gaze stayed forward, but she was aware of the people around her. Bystanders had begun to move closer, whispering quietly to each other, their attention now shifting to her rather than the bikers. A few pedestrians stepped up, offering smiles or small nods of recognition. Some quietly expressed their admiration, murmuring about her calmness, her strength, and the way she had handled the situation. A young man leaning against a lamppost whispered to his friend, "Did you see that?" She didn't even yell or fight, and she made them back off. The friend nodded, equally impressed, while a few others recorded the moment on their phones, not for sensationalism, but because it felt like witnessing something remarkable in the middle of an ordinary day. The bikers, sensing that their audience had shifted, tried to recover their confidence, but it was too late. The energy they had relied on, the fear, the uncertainty they forced on others, was gone. The calm determination she had shown had rendered their intimidation tactics ineffective. Their laughter now sounded hollow, their gestures uncertain. They tried to exchange whispered words among themselves, probably attempting to come up with a plan, but there was no easy answer. The moment had slipped from their control, and they were painfully aware of it. One of the bikers finally spoke, his voice quieter this time, less confident. "Let's just go," he muttered, glancing nervously at the woman as if to gauge whether she would even notice or care. The others hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding in agreement. They had no choice but to retreat, slowly moving toward their bikes. Even as they revved their engines lightly to save face, the attempt felt hollow, almost meaningless. The earlier bravado had completely evaporated, leaving behind the uncomfortable truth that they had been outmaneuvered without her raising a hand. She didn't stop to watch them leave, didn't smile or taunt, and didn't acknowledge them further. She simply continued walking with the same steady rhythm, her steps grounded and confident. There was a quiet strength in the way she carried herself, a presence that demanded respect without ever needing to assert it loudly. The bikers' retreat was their choice, but it was also a silent acknowledgement of her control over the situation. Bystanders, sensing the resolution, began to relax. The tension in the street eased as people resumed their routines, though many cast glances at her with lingering admiration. Some quietly commented to each other about the courage and poise she had shown, recognizing that standing firm in the face of intimidation required more strength than most people could muster. A few children walking nearby glanced curiously, perhaps picking up on the subtle lesson that strength could come from calm confidence rather than aggression. A woman holding a small child stopped to nod at her, smiling softly. "You handled that really well," she said quietly, her voice warm with admiration. The woman nodded politely, acknowledging the comment with a small, composed smile. There was no need for grand gestures or words. The actions had spoken clearly enough. Her ability to maintain control, to navigate the situation with precision, had left an impression that words could never fully capture. The bikers had now moved off the street, their engines fading into the distance. Their attempt to dominate and intimidate had failed completely, leaving them with nothing but the memory of a situation they could not control. They had come expecting fear or argument, perhaps even a quick confrontation, but she had denied them that satisfaction. In doing so, she had not only protected herself but had also demonstrated a quiet kind of authority that the street had taken notice of. She paused for a moment, allowing herself a brief breath, feeling the energy of the street around her. There was relief, certainly, but also a subtle pride in how she had handled the encounter. Not pride in a boastful sense, but in the quiet confidence of someone who had faced an unexpected challenge and navigated it with poise. She had remained aware, calm, and deliberate throughout, and the results spoke for themselves. The city around her continued its rhythm. The hum of traffic, the chatter of people, and the occasional bark of a dog all blending into the ordinary soundtrack of a morning. Yet within that ordinary setting, an extraordinary moment had occurred. A lesson in awareness, calmness, and the quiet power of confidence had played out in real time. The bikers, though physically imposing and loud, had been rendered ineffective by a combination of poise, timing, and presence. A few of the bystanders lingered a little longer, perhaps hoping to catch a glimpse of her again, or to understand how someone could carry themselves so completely in a moment that others would find overwhelming. Some quietly offered words of praise or reassurance, while others simply observed in silent respect. The way she had handled the situation was a reminder that strength was often about the mind and presence, not just the body or loudness of action. She resumed her walk, moving toward her destination with purposeful steps. The morning sun reflected softly off the pavement, illuminating her path as if reinforcing the clarity of her calm determination. The city continued to move around her, but she moved in her own rhythm, grounded in the quiet confidence that had allowed her to face intimidation without fear. The lesson she had demonstrated, though subtle, was powerful. Control over oneself and awareness of others could turn any challenge into an opportunity for strength. Even as she disappeared further down the street, the impact of the encounter lingered. The bikers had retreated, their image of power tarnished by their own inability to predict or handle her calm response. Bystanders carried the memory of what they had witnessed, some sharing it quietly with friends, others contemplating the subtle lesson in confidence and awareness. The street had returned to its usual rhythm, but the moment had left an indelible mark on everyone who had been present. She allowed herself a small smile, not out of triumph, but out of satisfaction at how the situation had unfolded. There had been no need for confrontation, no need for aggression. Her calmness and presence had been enough to diffuse the tension completely. She had maintained control, protected herself, and left an impression that would not be forgotten by those who had witnessed it. As she moved on, her mind reflected briefly on the unexpected nature of the morning. She had been going about her day, unaware that she would encounter a group of people intent on testing her composure. Yet the experience had been a reminder of the importance of self-awareness, presence, and the quiet strength that comes from remaining grounded. It was a lesson she carried with her now, one that would stay long after the engines had faded and the bikers had left the scene behind. Even the street itself seemed to return to a more neutral rhythm after she had passed. Life continued, but the memory of the encounter lingered in subtle ways. People who had been hesitant at first now walked with a little more awareness, some with a quiet sense of admiration for the calm power she had demonstrated. The bikers had faded into the background, no longer a dominating force, but the story of what had happened would carry with it the reminder that strength often came in unexpected forms. For her, the day moved on as well. She had handled the situation, faced the unexpected with calm and precision, and emerged unshaken. The encounter had been intense, yes, but it had also been affirming, a reminder of the power of awareness, timing, and quiet confidence. She carried herself forward, grounded, composed, and fully aware that she had met a challenge with grace and strength. As the city continued to bustle around her, she moved with a sense of calm clarity, knowing that she had handled something that could have been chaotic with ease. The bikers had left, the bystanders had witnessed an example of quiet power, and she had remained true to herself throughout. The encounter was now behind her, but the lessons and the sense of accomplishment stayed with her, a reminder that strength was not always loud, not always physical, but often quiet, precise, and unshakable. The city had returned to its usual rhythm, but she carried with her the quiet energy of the morning's events. The encounter with the bikers, though brief, had left a lasting impression, not just on them, but on the people who had witnessed it. She walked down the street with a sense of calm purpose, her steps deliberate, her mind reflecting on what had just happened. There was no rush, no lingering tension, just a steady awareness of the space she occupied and the life around her. Even as the sounds of traffic and chatter filled the streets, she noticed subtle changes in how people interacted around her. Some glanced her way with quiet respect, perhaps remembering how she had moved through a situation that could have turned chaotic. A few whispered to each other, recounting the moment with admiration for the way she had handled herself. She didn't seek attention or validation, but the acknowledgement was there, an unspoken understanding that strength and composure could leave an impression stronger than words or aggression ever could. The bikers had disappeared from sight, their retreat a quiet acknowledgement of her control over the encounter. She thought briefly of their stunned expressions, the forced laughs that had no conviction, and the awkward way they had tried to regain dominance. It was a reminder that intimidation often relies more on expectation than action, and when someone refuses to follow the script, the power dynamic shifts immediately. She had not only protected herself but had also challenged the assumptions of those who believed strength was defined by volume and posturing. As she continued on her path, she allowed herself a small smile, a private acknowledgement of her own strength. There was pride, certainly, but it was the calm pride of someone who had faced a challenge with awareness and grace, not the loud pride of boasting. She reflected on how easy it could have been to react with anger or fear, to respond to provocation in ways that would escalate tension unnecessarily. Instead, she had remained poised, demonstrating that control comes from within, and that power often speaks in silence and presence rather than in words or force. Bystanders slowly returned to their routines, but she could feel the subtle influence of what had happened. People who had initially paused or watched nervously now moved with a slightly different energy. They had witnessed a lesson in composure, in self-awareness, and in the quiet assertion of personal boundaries. Children walking nearby might not have understood every nuance, but they could sense the confidence she carried, the way she commanded space without aggression. It was a demonstration of strength that transcended age and experience, something that left a lasting impression. She reached a small cafe, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee greeting her as she entered. It was a simple, ordinary space, but it felt calm, almost comforting after the intensity of the street encounter. She ordered her coffee quietly, her movement still deliberate and unhurried. The barista glanced at her, smiling briefly as if recognizing the calm aura she carried, though perhaps unaware of the morning's events. She found a table near the window, allowing herself a moment to sit and reflect while the city moved on around her. As she sipped her coffee, she thought about the bikers and the way their behavior had changed so quickly. Confidence, she realized, often depends on the perception of power rather than its actual presence. They had assumed control based on assumptions about how people would react. Her refusal to follow that expectation had disrupted their sense of authority, leaving them unsure, uncomfortable, and ultimately retreating. It was a subtle but powerful reminder that presence, awareness, and calm determination often matter more than physical size or loudness. A few customers glanced her way as they moved around the cafe, some offering small smiles of recognition, perhaps sensing the quiet power she exuded. She didn't seek attention, but it was present nonetheless, a natural byproduct of the way she carried herself. The street encounter had been brief, but it had required focus, observation, and self-control. Now in the calm of the cafe, she allowed herself a deeper breath, appreciating the ordinary moments of the day and the contrast they provided to the morning's intensity. She reflected on the subtle lessons of the encounter. Strength, she realized, wasn't about winning through confrontation or asserting dominance through aggression. It was about presence, awareness, and the quiet confidence that allows someone to navigate difficult situations with clarity and precision. By maintaining control of her own reactions, she had been able to influence the outcome without ever needing to raise her voice or use force. That understanding would stay with her, a reminder of her capability and resilience in a world that often tests boundaries unexpectedly. The street outside continued to bustle, but the bikers had faded from sight. She knew they would remember the encounter, likely reconsidering their assumptions about intimidation and control. Perhaps they would think twice before attempting to provoke someone in the same way again. The moment had shifted the dynamic, not just for her, but for those who had witnessed it. Observers, whether consciously or not, had learned that true confidence does not rely on aggression but on clarity, poise, and self-awareness. She left the cafe, coffee in hand, and continued down the street. The city moved around her in its usual rhythm, yet she felt a subtle shift in her own perception. Every glance, every step, every interaction carried more awareness than before. The morning had been an unexpected test, but she had met it fully, demonstrating control, calmness, and strength. She carried that sense of empowerment with her, not as a shield but as a quiet companion, a reminder of what she was capable of when faced with challenges. As she walked past familiar shops and streets, she noticed small gestures of acknowledgement from strangers, a nod, a smile, a subtle glance of recognition. It wasn't necessary for anyone to comment. The respect and awareness were enough. She felt the connection to the city in a different way now, recognizing that strength and composure often ripple outward in ways that are quiet but powerful. The morning encounter had created a small wave in the lives of those who witnessed it, a moment of reflection and admiration that would linger beyond the immediate scene. She passed a park where children were playing, the sound of laughter bright and lively. A father pushed a stroller along the path, glancing curiously as she walked by. She didn't pause or acknowledge them directly, but there was a sense of presence that naturally drew attention. People tend to notice those who carry themselves with calm authority, even in the midst of ordinary surroundings. The subtle lesson of the morning, the quiet power of composure and confidence, was now woven into the fabric of the day. The thought occurred to her that true empowerment isn't about dominating others, but about understanding and controlling one's own reactions. She had faced intimidation without fear, had disrupted aggression without force, and had navigated a tense moment with clarity. That realization wasn't just satisfying, it was transformative. She understood now more than ever that resilience comes from self-awareness, that strength often manifests in subtle actions, and that control over oneself can influence situations far more than any external show of power. As the afternoon approached, she felt a sense of accomplishment, not loud or boastful but deep and steady. She had faced a group of people who intended to provoke, challenge, or intimidate, and she had done so with composure, clarity, and precision. The bikers had retreated, the bystanders had observed, and the city had continued. Yet the morning had left an indelible mark on everyone involved. She carried that experience forward, not as a story of conflict, but as a demonstration of what can be achieved through calm, measured presence. She thought about the bikers again, imagining how they would replay the encounter in their minds. They had come expecting to provoke, to assert dominance, and to witness reactions of fear or anger. Instead, they had met someone entirely different, someone who commanded space and respect without shouting, without aggression, and without fear. The lesson was subtle but powerful. Assumptions about power can be upended by awareness, composure, and self-assurance. The city moved around her, the hum of activity blending with the quieter moments she carried within herself. She paused briefly to watch a street musician playing a soft melody, the music drifting across the street. In that moment, she felt the contrast between the morning's intensity and the simple pleasures of everyday life. Both were part of the same city, part of the same experience, but the morning had taught her the value of calm, the power of presence, and the quiet strength that comes from knowing oneself. She continued walking toward her destination, each step deliberate and mindful. The energy of the morning lingered, a quiet undercurrent of empowerment that reminded her she was capable of facing challenges with clarity and composure. She carried that sense of self-assurance forward, understanding that life often presents unexpected tests, but that true strength comes from how one responds, not how loudly one asserts dominance.